It was in the late 70s. I was a new reporter at the Hartford Current, and the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, which is based in Louisiana, had undertaken a recruiting drive for new members in Connecticut. It was well covered. It was kind of a big story, a splashy story. The Klan comes to Connecticut. I was a reporter at the Hartford Current newspaper, which is the state's largest newspaper. And I had this idea. They were leafleting at high schools and at factory parking lots. The grand wizard, a guy named David Duke, was doing interviews, talking about the fact that he, for whatever reason, found Connecticut to be a good place to recruit for new members. So I asked my city editor, why don't I join? Why don't I fill it out? Why don't I see what's really going on? Duke is telling TV, radio, and even us in interviews that he's got 300 new members. Is that true or not? So that was the point of the deception, was to find out how large or small the Connecticut Klan was. Because he would not, David Duke, well, he would give interviews. He would not put any of the local media in touch with any of the local Klans people. So I came up with a fake name. I came up with this sort of fake identity. I contacted the headquarters in Metairie, Louisiana. I enrolled, as they say, and stayed in touch. And then after a while, the breakthrough came in the real active deception in terms of me personally, physically, was Duke came to Connecticut late fall of 1979 and did a bunch of press conferences, but then they had made arrangements for a secret meeting in Danbury where they had rented a Grange Hall. And so I had been in touch with Louisiana, and they basically told me where to go, where to be that night. So I attended that meeting under this false identity, and obviously not as a journalist. They wouldn't have let me in, and got the story that it was really not there was only about 12 people there. So it was a good story because it exposed that this was much ado about nothing. Well, actually, we let them know before the story was published, because you don't want to run a story and have that whole deceptive practice be a surprise to them. At that meeting, I met the Connecticut leader, and so prior to publication, because that's what our interest was: who in Connecticut is in charge, and how many members do they really have? Those questions were both answered at this meeting. So prior to actually running the story, the other reporter and I who were working on it, we called that man I met that night and told him, I called him, and I made up this name, Richard Lambright. And he answered the phone and he said, "Hey Rich, how you doing?" And I said, "Hi," and then I said, "I'm not really Richard Lambright." I told him my real name, and I said, "I don't really work at a gas station. I'm a reporter for the Hartford Current." And it got a little tense. But then, that's what we did before the story ran. And the story included, in the middle of it, some explanation of what we did. Well, I think looking back in the earlier part of my career, I think I would, in order to get a story or an interview or to find out some information, I might call someone up, and instead of identifying myself as a reporter, I might say, I'm someone looking for an apartment, because it might be about real estate and maybe some kind of green lining, red lining that they called it. To me, at the time, I think I lied too easily in some of those instances. I think, generally speaking, it was a different time when I think journalists did that too easily, because that's unethical. But at the time, it seemed like a necessary thing to do to get a story that was newsworthy and important and served the public. So that was sort of the rationale. But I think we could have and should have, in hindsight, in the way I think my own perception of these things has evolved, is that it's either you don't do it at all, or it's a tool or an option of last resort, and that there probably are usually, although it might take longer, other ways to get the information that don't involve easily lying like that. Lying is unethical. Deceiving, going undercover is unethical. Breaking the law to get a story is both unethical and illegal. I can create a hypothetical when I would justify any of those in order to get a certain story. I think, but again, I think they should be tools of last resort, so that you're not unethical. I think, and I think these things trend over time. And I think during the 70s and 80s, there was fairly common practice of what I'll call lying and deception to get stories, the ends justifying the means. And then I think that peaked in the late 70s, early 80s. And since then, there's been a correction of sorts. This is broadly speaking, where there's been a real appreciation or better understanding of, well, do we really have to be doing that in order to get the story? And is that just an easier way instead of taking the harder but more ethically sound way? Or you'll hear a lot of reporters and editors sounding a little holier than thou, and issuing kind of absolute pronouncement that lying or deception is never acceptable and stuff. And I just modify that a little bit, that it's generally unacceptable. But there are instances when I think it's not only an option but perhaps necessary in order to get a story. I'm glad he did what he did in releasing all that information about government surveillance activities and the scope of it. It's obviously put him in the crosshairs, under the laws as they are. I mean, he's a criminal, but I think he's done a terrific thing in terms of freedom of information. That's my view of it. I hope there's some kind of resolution to that ultimately, where he is left alone. But I think what he did was an act of courage.